the next item on the agenda is the council submissions on the proposed replacement district plan stage 1. I have an additional recommendation that I want to make in regard to this one, which is that approve by, now I might need some help from staff on this, but approved by round robin, which is essentially that we will circulate it in time for the submission. But as a council, we would like to make a very strong statement on behalf of our communities to the hearings panel, because we hand over the district plan and we don't receive it back until it's completed. We would like to really emphasise the elements of the strategic directions chapter, which emphasise our community's desire for quality urban design in the rebuild of our city, and to emphasise other aspects of the really the principles that have guided us in the work that we've done, and to emphasise to them that probably that there is a concern that with all of the stresses and strains that people are under at the moment, that we may not get the input from the wider community, that we've received, and so we want to kind of place that on record that these are what lie behind, and that we're speaking for our community, not for some sort of planning paradigm.
Yeah. Morning, councillors, Madam Chair. Yes, thank you. I think that would be a great idea. May I suggest, though, that may be best placed to do as a further submission once we know all of the submissions that come in, because, for example, I'm aware that there will be a whole of government submission, and it will have impacts on all of the various chapters. Generally, this first round, this penultimate meeting that we're having on submissions, is the second to last step, the very last step or input that this council has before, as you say, it goes offshores and disappears to the hearings panel until decisions are made. The very last step is further submissions, where the council can make comment on original submissions, which is this round. Yeah. So generally this round, because it is already the council's plan, so we've already approved it to go through and be notified. That's why this round of submissions are technical, purely technical, for the most part simply to make corrections or clarifications. But the further submission round is when it's a good opportunity to then put council's final sort of stamp on the submissions, you might say.
So what's the time for that, Brigitte?
They close on the 6th of November. I have talked to the staff who organise your committees to pencil in a date on the 4th of November for that final submissions process,
right.
Further submissions. It is a very tight time frame. These submissions, or the original submissions, are to be made publicly available by the 22nd of October. Mm-hmm. Then they're open for 10 working days for further submissions. So we are actually looking at the submissions as they come in and taking note of where issues are arising, so that the staff here who wrote those first chapters can offer suggested recommendations to you for a further submission if considered necessary, and then what you've just said could go in that further round.
How quickly could you have for us? I mean, are you able to sort of kind of provide us with a sort of an ongoing sort of high level, these are the submissions type things? I mean, I'd be really interested in having a briefing note that's not as long as the whole of government submission, but a briefing note on the whole of government one with the flavour and the direction.
Yes. We'll turn that round as quickly as possible. What has happened is the norm across the whole of New Zealand is that a few submissions trickled in the first couple of weeks, and as you know, they're open for 20 working days, 4 weeks. Now they're starting to flood in, and the biggest ones usually come in at the very last day, which is what I'm expecting possibly for the whole of government submission and legal submissions. So we will turn that round as quickly as possible. We need to anyway to be able to have them available to the public, but we also need to understand them and get it back to you as soon as possible for your approval of that further submission.
Yeah, I saw your statement, I think it was yesterday or the day before, you know, sort of reminding people to get their submissions in, because we are concerned that the public themselves really ought to be making submissions, that the process is for them. That's good.
Yes.
I might put out another submission next week. It closes on Wednesday, doesn't it?
It closes on the 8th, yes.
Yeah, right. Thank you. Yanni.
We've just been given this, how can I put it nicely, rather alarming map around tsunami inundation areas, which sort of wipes out quite a lot of our ward, actually, along the coastal community. We just would be quite useful just to hear, actually, what this map is for. I was under the impression the other day that there was still tsunami risk modelling that had yet to be completed and done. So, I just really wanted to understand the implications of what we've just been given, and I think it's important publicly for you to tell us what it means.
Absolutely. You have in front of you, or you've just been given out an extra 2 pages which have 2 new submissions on which weren't in the report, and the one regarding that map that you're talking about. And I will ask Scott here, who's the author of that chapter, to talk to this, but the map is replacing a whole lot of words that were originally in the district plan, and we've had feedback from people that it's much easier to understand the map than it is the words. But so if you look on the very first page of the handout that you were just given, it's the first submission. So Scott, would you like to speak to that?
The origin of the map is essentially a report by the regional council in regard to a study they undertook last year. It was concluded last year in regard to a potential inundation area resulting from an earthquake originating on or near South America. So we're talking about a tsunami, an earthquake that would happen on or near South America that would then create a column of water that would travel across the Pacific and then come to, and basically it could hit Christchurch. It doesn't deal with, as I understand it, a near shore earthquake event at this stage. I understand that at some point in the future the regional council will be looking into that. But at this stage, its position in the city plan relates to CERA's intensification provisions of the 6th of December last year, where they notified the land use recovery plan, and as part of that land use recovery plan, there were a number of intensification measures relating to things like the replacement of 2 houses for 1, or the enhanced development mechanism, or the community housing redevelopment mechanism. Now, as part of the exclusion areas on those were the tsunami areas. Was this tsunami area taken from the regional council report? In terms of the study or the work that council officers have undertaken in the last year or so in regard to the potential intensification measures additional to those in phase 1, we've used the same criteria or the same tsunami report to identify areas that are that we feel are at this stage inappropriate for intensification because of the risk associated with the tsunami inundation area. That's not to say we're not, or the council is not proposing any additional rules, say in terms of structures and those sorts of things. It's simply one of the criteria that we use to identify areas that should not, at this stage at least, be intensified because of the risk associated with it.
Is that all intensification, or is it just the provisions that came in as part of the land use recovery plan around where you could add an extra house?
It's the 6 December LERP intensification measures, and it's one of the criteria that we used in identifying or discounting areas of intensification for an increase in density. The former living 1 and 2 into the living 3, the residential medium density.
So if you look at New Brighton, there's no L3 going into New Brighton or L2?
There are existing high density areas there that will remain, but there's no new intensification areas going into that area.
Glenn?
Thank you. My question over this is, while it's one thing I think to be responsible as a council to give indicative sea level rise mapping in the district plan, for me, I just wonder what signal this could send to the communities, but by way of future investment.
This is tsunami inundation, not sea level rise.
I know.
That's right.
That the sea level rise must be included, but this, to me, seems quite alarming.
No, they're required to under the LERP. Under the LERP, the intensification provisions do not apply in tsunami inundation levels. Sorry, I've taken this to mean that you're replacing words with a map.
That's correct.
That's
and
correct.
The words actually referred to the map that was in the ECAN website. So I don't know. I mean, yes, it's pretty blunt when it's set out like this, but that's what the word said. So we're not changing anything. It's what we're required to do.
Yeah.
Well, it's the
David,
signal
David,
it
and then
sends
Paul.
to the community.
Yeah, I know, but the truth is that anyone who lives on a coastline knows that if there's a tsunami, they're going to get hit before anyone else.
Look, I'd just like to comment on the map itself, in as much as right along that coastline there are anything up to 14-metre high sand dunes, which don't really show as being, they're included in a flood-prone area. And I think, the word tsunami conjures up a sort of a 10-metre wave coming in. We're talking about a continuous wave coming in, and it's flooding, not a surge wave coming in rather than... so it's a flooding area, and I think really that whole coastline on the map is not portrayed accurately. That the flooding actually will come in through the estuary and then potentially inundate the areas behind it. And it's not showing that actually a large portion of that coastline is exempt from flooding. The map indicates really that maybe it's a bit of a blurring between the district boundary and the hash marks of the inundation area, but I don't think it clearly outlines the high ground along the coastline that's not subject to inundation. And as Glenn points out, I think, it is a worry for people that live in this area in terms of their long-term future when we talk about these inundation areas and tsunami and lowering of the land post-earthquake. So I'd really like that map to accurately reflect the fact that for probably a good 50 metres or more inland from the high water springs mark, you cannot flood that area with tsunami. So the map to me needs refinement, and it's clear that there are other areas along the coast there, particularly Sumner, that for that area to be breached, it actually requires the sea walls and things to be breached.
Yeah, but once the seawall's breached, and it doesn't need to be breached from the front, it can be breached from the side, and it's got nowhere to run out.
In Sumner, that would be
Sumner's
difficult.
actually the highest risk area in that regard.
But I'm just saying the map itself does not accurately reflect
But
the
we
high
are
ground.
not scientists, and so perhaps if we could get...
Through you, Madam Chair, the map comes from the Regional Council. It is not a map that we can change. It is the map that the LERP asked us to refer to. Through further work that I understand is to be undertaken in long-term hazard management strategy, such a map can be changed or included into a future district plan review or a plan change.
Well, I'm just suggesting that the map is inaccurate.
But the map isn't ours,
No.
and it was referred to in the original paper. But anyway, Paul, and then Jamie.
Concern for me is this is a tsunami inundation from a shelf displacement halfway around the world.
That's correct.
So have we done any modelling of a shelf displacement a lot closer in? Because obviously this is quite alarming, but I would imagine that one closer would almost reach Central City.
That would be there's two parts to that. I understand that that the regional council will be undertaking some further work in terms of a closer earthquake event inshore or just offshore. How far a tsunami would go is from that event is very hard to. It would be pure speculation on our part at this stage.
I suppose it's how much shelf displacement there actually is, to how big a wave and how much surge it's going to have.
That's correct.
But we are very flat, so you can assume that it'll be a lot worse than this.
Not being an
No.
expert, but logically,
No,
necessarily.
inshore, nowhere
that's
near.
right. Yeah, there's a potential for the column of water from a far event to be larger
Yeah.
than an area event.
I think there have been studies done on what an inshore would do, and I've got in my mind 1 metre, 1 metre displacement.
Our topography offshore, really, our fault lines are all shear lines. They're not displacements. So the potential for a close seismic action that would cause a displacement to cause a tsunami wave locally, next to nil. The nearest one is a slump in the Kaikoura Trench.
Yeah.
Would actually cause something that would probably come down and fire at Sumner. But directly offshore from our coastline, there's no seismic.
You could argue that because we've
But
got
I
we've had
think that
earthquakes.
we should actually have this discussion in the public arena with all of the factual information, and I think we're going to do that with the natural hazards chapter. Would that be right?
Yes.
Yeah, but
Yeah,
through your chair, we've actually had earthquakes we didn't, and on fault lines we never knew existed. So I would actually say that what we have and what we haven't got, we don't really know.
Yeah, but Dave's right. In the type of, it does matter what type of fault line it is. So, but I mean, we are going to do a lot more work on this as part of the second phase.
Yes, we are doing more work, and the coastal hazards work is all in the second phase of the district plan. So there's further modelling work being done, and in response to Councillor East's concerns, what map you draw obviously depends on what size tsunami you are modelling. So in smaller events, you're correct, not all of those areas would be subject to inundation, but they've chosen here to map a larger event, and it's those sorts of decisions which lead to the different maps.
Not going to inundate. An average along our coastline at the moment is probably somewhere about 8 metres of sand
Hang on,
dunes. You ain't going to inundate them.
Point of order, Madam
Yep.
Chair. We need to have the debate, and check the questions with the staff from a scientific point of view, and then have the debate. And I'm concerned about that in terms of process.
Yeah, but I also, I'm just a little bit concerned that people are reading into this more than what it is. All it is that the government has said with the land use recovery plan that these are areas that we don't intensify under our district plan. So they don't change the rules under the district plan, and they really change nothing. They're just simply saying the government's not interested in intensifying in these areas. That they're more exposed than areas that aren't marked in purple. That doesn't mean that that they're facing the risk of a tsunami any old time. So anyway, Jamie, and then and then Glenn. Yeah.
Thanks. Look, given that Littleton and Nakaroa are obviously part of our territorial authority limits within that, why are their harbours not included on this map, and what are, if any, the implications for those two areas?
Because none of their areas were covered by the alert for intensification.
And indeed, that is one of the issues that is raised in the first bullet point that I'd like to bring to your attention. The first two bullet points under 4.3 of the report were raised at the community board meeting on the 6th of September that we had with councillors, where the councillor for those areas also considered, the community boards considered that some of these intensification areas should extend out to Littleton and wider on the Banks Peninsula. Scott has done a lot further work to indicate whether or not that could or couldn't happen. It is in the district. It is here for your consideration as a submission, whether or not you want to include that in a council submission or whether you would like to leave that to the community board to raise in its own submission is something for you to consider
And that's
today.
probably a question for another day. But and I realise that LERP isn't covered in that, but I just think that with a map like this, it's going to raise natural questions around that. Just because they have coastlines, they have harbours, they're part of the Christchurch City Council.
That's
area.
correct, but what I'm suggesting with this map is no different to what you had already signed off in the district plan review. All this is a replacement of a map for words in the plan that you had already signed off.
Yep. Glenn?
Yeah, thank you. Quite happy to have this information out there. Obviously, we have to, it's legal, we must. But when it comes to that discussion and mapping, etc., do we include some of those features that may help mitigate natural hazards, such as the dunes? ECAN says that the minimum due height must be 7 metres along the coast. And and not for us to interpret on the community's behalf, but for them to make up their own minds. So we just present them with that what we would do, so we would actually map.
It's the purpose. So, I mean, I'm sure that those things can be addressed when we get to the chapter.
Yes.
But the purpose of this map is purely to identify the areas that the LERP will not go in terms of intensification. So it serves no other purpose other than that. And all we've done is replace words with a map. Now, the map has obviously, highlighted the fact that that would have been highlighted if you'd gone to the ECAM website and looked at the map.
That's correct.
When you considered the words. But the truth is that, I mean, we had a massive program for considering the various chapters of the district plan that we've already done. And I didn't go and look at the tsunami picture, but the map, but I've seen it before. I've seen it more than once because I've often looked at the ECAM website for various issues when I represented this area. So it's not a surprise, but it's the only thing that it doesn't say is what size tsunami is it modelled on, because I think it is modelled on a very high wave of water, which is why the risks are relatively low. And the point that one would make is that there's an enormous amount of time given as by way of warning.
I guess it's just a bold presentation of this.
'Cause it's,
that's the concern.
no, we don't. Well, I don't know the size that ECAN used. It's
No, I'm sorry. We don't know the assumptions that were behind it. We can find out if you'd like to know.
It would be useful just for us because, I mean, obviously this will spark some public interest now.
But there will be more information coming through on all of these coastal type matters in the coastal chapter, which
Yes,
is part
we
of stage 2.
Totally get that, but this will be the subject of public discussion as a result of it coming up today.
I'll distribute that to you through a memo.
Fantastic, thank you. All right.
Can I just ask,
Yep.
these areas would have otherwise been such
Well, we haven't considered that because of this map. Yes.
Yanni?
So I really welcome the opportunity to provide a kind of high-level principles-based submission. But when I read through this submission, it seems to be taking on board the Minister's statement of expectations and reducing a whole bunch of notification requirements, urban design requirements, and the need for consents, which I think is quite fundamentally different to what I would feel as a councillor that our district plan should require. So when I look through your commercial and industrial chapters, I see a whole bunch of things being removed. To give one example, outline development plans you're watering down the ability for people to be involved around notification if they're amended. Given what we had with Noble, I couldn't support doing that. In fact,
What
if
page?
anything, they should be strengthened. So,
What page?
Using the page numbers on the bottom, 144.
144.
And which particular amendment?
Yeah, so if item 40, the requirement for consent, it talks about non-compliance with matters shown on the ODP, which will be shown in greater detail on a development plan, are not anticipated to affect persons other than landowners. It is therefore not considered appropriate to require written approvals or public notification to a wider area.
We've already agreed to that. It's the wording in the last column that we're adding by way of submission.
Yeah, the amendment sought is to
Written approval may be
reduce-
sought from other landowners and/or the Canterbury Regional Council in respect of the location area for a public transport interchange. However, any application required by this rule should not require written approvals or be limited or publicly notified to other persons. So that's being added.
That's proposed in council's submission in respect of row 38, which is the Belfast ODP area. If I can just comment, as you may recall, when we came to you in response to the minister's comments, we put forward as a response to the minister's comments a number of clauses to introduce that removes the need for notification and doesn't require written approvals. And we've revisited what we put to you then and gone back and reviewed what rules we'd proposed that clause for. And the rules that we're proposing that clause for reflects what's in the operative city plan. So the future Belfast Commercial Centre, for which there's an outline development plan, the current operative city plan states that except for landowners and the Canterbury Regional Council, there shouldn't be other parties whose written approval is required, or that any application in that respect shouldn't be notified. So what we've proposed in this submission is really reflecting on what is in the operative plan at the present time and applying that to Ferrymead, and the Ferrymead outline development plan really reflects that approach in the operative plan to the Belfast outline development plan.
Look, I hear what you're saying. I guess what I'm trying to say is that the outline development plans at the moment don't work. They fundamentally are flawed, because what happens is you get your ODP and it's easy to change it without the community knowing what the changes are. Changes get put in place and community feel excluded from decisions around the future of their local neighbourhoods. And we've seen that with the Noble subdivision. So I don't personally support adding any further text that gives a direction that people should be excluded from participating in ODPs. I can't support that, given what we've learnt from Noble, from Ferrymead, from other areas, where actually the community have said they would like to be notified of when there are changes, because they feel that that's an important aspect of their local neighbourhood. So when do we change that? How do we change that?
The proposed amendments are sought for consideration in council's submission. The Belfast ODP area, the ODP defines matters such as the location of the public transport interchange within the site, as well as the route of the road that runs through that zone. But you consider the surrounding context, and you've got a railway line on one side, you've got a commercial development on the north side of that zone, you've got a state highway on the west side, and the affected parties in respect of where the main road goes and where the public transport interchange goes are the landowners within that zone, and we're not preventing notification to those landowners or to the regional council. We're saying that someone that lives half a kilometre away in Northwood shouldn't be notified on where the road goes through that zone, because it's really a matter for council to assess and determine what is the most appropriate alignment for that road. And if you go down the process of notifying all parties or a much wider catchment, then that leads to a potentially longer process and more costly process, when in fact the effects are going to be limited to what's within that zone.
I can't understand. No, I don't understand the point that you're raising.
So if you look
the
at-
requirement for consent is triggered by one of the following: non-compliance with an ODP, non-compliance with an approved development plan, and non-compliance in not identifying matters required as part of the development plan. It's all subject to the approval of the ODP. Surely that's in the control of the council at that point. Doesn't the council sign off on the ODP?